The day Ethan Blackwood fired a man for being 3 minutes late was the day I realized some people worship rules more than they value people. I didn't know Ethan personally back then. Honestly, I only knew his name because everyone in New York seemed to know it. Blackwood Capital was everywhere. On skyscrapers. On television. On the plaques inside museums and hospitals. If a major project needed funding, chances were Ethan Blackwood's signature was somewhere behind it. At 34, he was one of the youngest billionaires in America. The kind of man magazines called brilliant. The kind of man employees called intimidating when they thought nobody was listening. The morning everything began, Manhattan was wrapped in gray clouds. Rain tapped softly against the glass walls of Blackwood Tower, 80 stories above the streets below. Inside the executive boardroom, silence sat heavier than the weather outside. 12 executives occupied leather chairs around a table long enough to seat a small-town council. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody even shifted in their seats. They were waiting. Ethan stood at the far end of the room, staring through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His reflection stared back. Dark suit, dark tie, dark eyes. Everything about him looked controlled, calculated, deliberate. Even the way he breathed seemed organized. A digital clock glowed on the conference room wall. 8:03 a.m. The door opened. A man hurried inside, slightly out of breath. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry. Traffic on FDR was backed up because of an accident." Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Ethan slowly turned around. The room felt colder immediately. "What time does this meeting begin?" he asked calmly. 8 o'clock. "And what time is it now?" The executive swallowed. 8:03. Ethan nodded once. "Thank you for confirming." The man looked relieved for half a second. Then Ethan spoke again. "Security will escort you downstairs. Human resources will provide information regarding your separation package." The executive stared at him. The rest of the room stared at the table. "Sir, it's 3 minutes." Ethan's expression never changed. "No, it's a decision." Silence. Pure silence. A few moments later, the man walked out. Nobody argued. Nobody defended him. Nobody questioned Ethan's judgment. Because nobody ever did. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened. Charts appeared. Financial projections filled screens. Billion-dollar acquisitions were discussed. Yet Ethan barely listened. His attention drifted toward the rain sliding down the windows. Most people assumed power made life easier. They were wrong. Power simply gave you larger things to worry about. At least that was what Ethan believed. Rules had built everything he owned. Rules protected success. Rules prevented disappointment. Rules eliminated uncertainty. And uncertainty was something Ethan Blackwood refused to tolerate. What nobody in that room knew was that by the end of that week, a woman named Grace Parker would walk into his life and break nearly every rule he lived by. Not because she wanted to challenge him. Not because she cared about his money. But because she wasn't impressed by any of it. And for a man who had spent years controlling every variable around him, meeting someone he couldn't predict would become the one thing he never saw coming. 3 days later, I met the first person who ever told Ethan Blackwood no. Her name was Grace Parker, and at the time, she was standing on a small stage inside an elementary school gymnasium in Brooklyn, holding a microphone that kept cutting in and out. The building was old. The paint on the walls had faded years ago. Folding chairs filled the room, occupied by parents, teachers, and local business owners attending a fundraiser for after-school programs. I was there because my younger cousin attended the school, and Grace was impossible not to notice. Not because she was trying to attract attention. Quite the opposite. She looked completely focused on the children sitting in the front row. Every time one of them laughed, she smiled. Every time one of them raised a hand, she listened as though their opinion mattered. That alone made her different from most people I knew. Across the gym, a row of expensive black SUVs pulled into the parking lot. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations lowered. Heads turned. Ethan Blackwood had arrived. The school principal nearly sprinted toward the entrance. Several board members straightened their jackets. A photographer hurried to prepare his camera. Ethan stepped inside surrounded by assistants and advisors. He looked exactly the same as he had in every magazine photo. Perfect posture. Tailored suit. Expression carefully neutral. The fundraiser had been hoping for a donation from Blackwood Capital for months. Rumors said Ethan might contribute enough money to renovate the entire building. The principal welcomed him personally and guided him toward the front row. Grace watched the commotion from the stage before returning her attention to her notes. If she felt impressed, she hit it well. 20 minutes later, Ethan was invited to speak. He stood behind the podium and outlined a proposal. Blackwood Capital would provide $5 million in funding. New classrooms, new technology, new athletic facilities. The room practically exploded with applause. Parents smiled. Teachers exchanged excited looks. Several people looked emotional. Then Ethan mentioned the conditions. The school would adopt a new educational model designed by consultants hired through his foundation. Existing programs would be replaced. Several teachers would be reassigned. Curriculum decisions would require external approval. The applause faded. People exchanged uncertain glances. Ethan continued speaking confidently. To him, it probably sounded efficient, practical, logical. Then Grace stood up. Nobody had invited her to speak. She simply stepped forward and raised her hand. The room became silent. Ethan looked directly at her. "Do you have a question?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Yes." Her voice sounded calm, respectful, completely fearless. "Have you ever spent a full day in one of our classrooms?" Ethan blinked once. "No." "Have you ever taught 30 students with different learning needs using outdated materials?" "No." Grace smiled politely. "Then with respect, I do not think you should be deciding what works best for them." The silence that followed felt enormous. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Every person in that gym seemed to realize the same thing at once. Grace Parker had just challenged Ethan Blackwood in public. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not immediately have an answer. The room remained frozen for several seconds after Grace spoke. "I remember hearing the faint hum of the gymnasium lights above us and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Nobody seemed to know what would happen next." Ethan Blackwood was not accustomed to being questioned, especially not in front of an audience. Yet Grace stood there calmly, one hand resting against the side of the stage, looking less like someone challenging a billionaire and more like a teacher waiting for a student to answer a difficult question. Ethan studied her for a moment. His expression revealed nothing. Then he glanced around the room. Parents were watching. Teachers were watching. Reporters were watching. Finally, he nodded once. "I appreciate your honesty," he said. The tension eased slightly. Grace gave a polite smile and returned to her seat. The event continued, but something had changed. At least for Ethan. Most people spent their lives trying to impress him. Some wanted money. Others wanted influence. Many simply wanted access to the world he controlled. Grace had wanted none of those things. She had not flattered him. She had not feared him. She had not even seemed interested in who he was. 2 days later, Ethan sat alone inside his office overlooking Manhattan. Morning sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, casting silver patterns across the polished floor. A tablet rested on his desk. A file filled the screen. Grace Parker, age 27, elementary school teacher, Brooklyn resident, master's degree in education. No scandals, no lawsuits, no financial problems, no connections to influential families. The report was remarkably ordinary. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. He could not identify what bothered him most. The fact that she challenged him, or the fact that he could not stop thinking about it. "Is there something specific you are looking for?" his assistant asked carefully. Ethan closed the file. No, but that was not true. He was looking for a reason. Everyone had motivations. Ambition, fear, pride, financial pressure. There was always something. Yet Grace seemed frustratingly genuine. Later that afternoon, Ethan attended 3 meetings, reviewed 2 acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and approved plans for a new development project in Chicago. Normally, that would have occupied every corner of his attention. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to a school gymnasium in Brooklyn and a teacher who had calmly dismantled his proposal in less than 60 seconds. Meanwhile, Grace was completely unaware of the effect she had created. She spent her afternoon helping students prepare science projects. She stayed after school to organize classroom supplies. She answered emails from parents and graded assignments at a small wooden desk covered in construction paper and markers. Ethan's name barely crossed her mind. To Grace, he was simply another wealthy executive who believed money automatically produced wisdom. That evening, as the city lights flickered on across Manhattan, Ethan found himself staring out his office window again. Thousands of people moved through the streets below. Millions lived within the city. Yet somehow his attention remained fixed on one woman who had looked him directly in the eye and spoken a truth nobody else seemed willing to say. For the first time in years, Ethan Blackwood was curious. And curiosity, he would soon discover, was far more dangerous to his carefully ordered world than any challenge to his authority. The following Monday, rain drifted across Brooklyn in a fine gray mist that blurred the city into watercolor shapes. School had just ended, and Grace was carrying a stack of student artwork toward the front office when she noticed three unfamiliar people standing near the principal's door. They wore expensive coats and carried tablets instead of notebooks. Corporate. The sight immediately made her suspicious. 20 minutes later, the entire faculty gathered in the library for an emergency meeting. The principal looked unusually excited. A large smile stretched across her face as she adjusted her glasses. "I have wonderful news," she announced. "Blackwood Capital has decided to move forward with a major funding package." Murmurs filled the room. Teachers exchanged hopeful looks. Grace felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "There are only a few administrative requirements," the principal continued. "Nothing significant. New reporting procedures. New performance metrics. A consulting team will help implement everything." Grace listened carefully. The details sounded strangely familiar. Different words. Same control. By the end of the presentation, several teachers looked relieved. Others looked overwhelmed. Grace raised her hand. "Will teachers have any authority in these decisions?" The room became quiet. The principal hesitated. "The consultants will provide recommendations." "That is not what I asked." More silence. "Will teachers have authority?" The principal's smile weakened. "Certain decisions will be made by the foundation." Grace nodded slowly. There it was. Exactly what she feared. After the meeting ended, she remained behind. Papers rustled. Chairs scraped across the floor. Eventually, only she and the principal remained. "Grace, please tell me you are not going to make this difficult. I am trying to protect the students." $5 million could change everything. Not if it comes with strings attached. The principal sighed heavily. Sometimes compromise is necessary. Grace looked through the library window toward the playground outside. Children were running beneath the cloudy sky, completely unaware of budgets and boardrooms. "Children are not business projects," she said quietly. "They are children." Across the East River, Ethan sat inside a conference room reviewing updates from the foundation. One of his advisors entered carrying a folder. "There is a problem." Ethan barely looked up. "What kind of problem?" "Grace Parker." That got his attention. The advisor opened the folder. "She is encouraging faculty members to request revisions to the agreement." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Why?" "According to multiple reports, she believes the school should maintain control over educational decisions." Ethan stared at the skyline outside his window. Most people would have accepted the funding without hesitation. Most people would have called it an opportunity. Grace viewed it as interference. Somehow that irritated him and impressed him at the same time. "Schedule a meeting," he said. "With the principal?" the advisor asked. Ethan shook his head. "With Grace Parker." The advisor looked surprised. Personally. Later that evening, Grace opened her email while drinking tea at her small kitchen table. One new message waited in her inbox. The sender's name made her pause. Blackwood Capital. Her eyes narrowed as she opened it. The invitation was polite, professional, direct. Ethan Blackwood wanted to meet her the following afternoon. Grace stared at the screen for several seconds. Then she laughed softly to herself. Because for the first time, it looked like the billionaire was the one requesting permission. The next afternoon, Grace stepped into Blackwood Tower carrying the same canvas tote bag she used every day at school. The contrast was almost comical. Around her, polished marble reflected sunlight from enormous windows. Men and women in expensive suits moved through the lobby with practiced urgency. Everything looked precise, ordered, controlled. It felt like Ethan had designed the building to mirror himself. A receptionist escorted Grace to the top floor. Moments later, she entered a private conference room overlooking Manhattan. Ethan was already there. He stood near the window, one hand in his pocket, the city stretching endlessly behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace noticed that he looked exactly as composed as he had at the fundraiser. Ethan noticed that she looked exactly as unbothered by his status as she had before. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I was curious," Grace replied as she sat down. "That makes one of us." A faint smile almost appeared on Ethan's face before disappearing. My advisors tell me you are encouraging resistance to the proposal. Resistance is a dramatic word. What word would you use? Grace folded her hands on the table. Questions. Ethan studied her carefully. $5 million would help that school tremendously. I agree. Then why oppose it? I do not oppose helping children. Her voice remained calm. I oppose assuming money automatically creates better decisions. Ethan leaned back slightly. Most people became nervous under his attention. Grace seemed completely unaffected. You believe teachers know better than experts? I believe people closest to a problem usually understand it best. That is not always true. Neither is believing executives always know best. The silence that followed felt strangely different from their previous encounters. Less hostile, more challenging. Like a chess match neither player wanted to abandon. Ethan opened a folder and slid a document across the table. These are the projected outcomes based on similar programs. Grace reviewed the pages. The numbers were impressive. Graduation rates, test scores, funding growth. She nodded honestly. This is good work. Ethan seemed surprised by the compliment. But, he asked. Grace looked up. But children are not spreadsheets. For a second, Ethan actually laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a brief sound that seemed to surprise even him. You really do not make this easy. Nobody ever said I should. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Education, community programs, leadership, responsibility. Neither convinced the other. Yet something unusual happened. Neither wanted the meeting to end. Eventually Grace stood. I need to get back to Brooklyn. Ethan walked her toward the elevator. As the doors opened, he spoke again. You know, most people would have accepted the funding exactly as offered. Grace stepped inside. That is probably why you expected me to. The elevator doors began to close. Ethan watched her for one final second. You are impossible. Grace smiled. That is not what my students say. The door slid shut. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Grace found herself smiling despite everything. And upstairs, standing alone above the city, Ethan realized something that irritated him more than he wanted to admit. He had scheduled the meeting expecting to change her mind. Instead, he had spent an entire hour looking forward to hearing what she would say next. For the next 2 weeks, something strange happened. Ethan and Grace kept finding reasons to cross paths. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. Officially, their meetings were about the school partnership. Unofficially, neither seemed eager to end the conversation once it started. One Thursday afternoon, Ethan visited the school again, this time without reporters, without photographers, without a carefully planned speech. He arrived carrying a notebook instead of a presentation. The children barely noticed who he was. To them, he was simply another adult walking through the hallway. Grace found that amusing. You seem disappointed, she said as they walked past a classroom. About what? Ethan asked. Nobody recognizes you. He glanced through the window at a group of third graders working on art projects. I think I will survive. Grace laughed softly. The sound caught him off guard. There was something effortless about the way she moved through the school. Students waved when they saw her. Teachers stopped to ask questions. Parents greeted her by name. She belonged here. Later, they sat in the empty cafeteria reviewing possible revisions to the funding agreement. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. The room smelled faintly of fresh paint and cafeteria coffee. You really care about this place, Ethan said. Grace looked around the room. Of course I do. Why? She seemed surprised by the question. Because somebody cared about me. Ethan remained silent. Grace closed her folder. When I was 12, one teacher stayed after school every day to help me. Nobody paid her extra. Nobody asked her to do it. She just believed I could do more than I believed myself. Her voice softened. One person changed my life. Ethan stared at the table. And that is why you became a teacher. Exactly. The answer came without hesitation. Ethan admired that. Most people his age were still searching for purpose. Grace had already found hers. What about you? She asked. Why business? Ethan looked away toward the window. Manhattan's skyline stood in the distance like steel monuments beneath the afternoon sky. I was good at it. Grace waited. That is not the real answer. Ethan almost smiled. She did that often. She ignored the answer people gave and somehow found the answer underneath. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. My father lost everything when I was 16. Grace listened carefully. The house, the company, the savings. His voice remained controlled, but something deeper lingered beneath the words. After that, uncertainty felt dangerous. Grace nodded slowly. Suddenly many things made sense. The rules, the control, the obsession with planning every detail. Ethan was not protecting success. He was protecting himself from ever feeling powerless again. For the first time, Grace saw something beyond the billionaire. Not the headlines, not the reputation, just a man carrying an old fear he never talked about. Neither spoke for a while. Outside, children laughed on the playground. Inside, the silence felt unexpectedly comfortable. Eventually Grace stood and gathered her papers. "You know," she said, "not everything valuable can be measured." Ethan looked up. "That sounds like something you tell your students." "Sometimes." She smiled. "Sometimes I tell it to stubborn billionaires." Grace walked away before he could respond. Ethan watched her disappear through the cafeteria doors. And for the first time in years, a quarterly report, a stock valuation, and a board meeting all felt significantly less interesting than a conversation he wished had lasted a little longer. The incident happened on a Friday evening during a public education forum hosted in Manhattan. School administrators, nonprofit leaders, local officials, and donors filled the auditorium. Ethan sat in the front row as one of the keynote sponsors. Grace had been invited to speak about challenges facing public schools. Neither expected the night to become memorable. At first, everything followed the schedule. Speakers discussed funding, technology, and policy. Charts appeared on giant screens. Statistics filled the room. Then a panel moderator asked a question that changed the atmosphere. What is the biggest mistake wealthy organizations make when trying to help public education? Several speakers offered careful answers. Safe answers. Diplomatic answers. Then the microphone reached Grace. She paused for a moment. The room grew quiet. "Sometimes," she said, "people become so focused on solving problems that they forget to listen to the people living them." A few heads nodded. Grace continued. "Money can create opportunities. It can build classrooms. It can provide resources. But sometimes people with influence assume they automatically understand what communities need simply because they have the power to fund solutions." The audience remained attentive. Ethan watched her carefully. He already knew where this was heading. "Good leadership requires listening," Grace said. "Not just directing. Not just deciding. Listening." The moderator smiled. "Can you give an example?" Grace hesitated. Then she looked directly toward the front row. "A person can build an empire and still believe every answer starts with their own opinion." The room went silent. Every eye followed her gaze. Straight toward Ethan Blackwood. A wave of nervous energy swept through the audience. Some people looked horrified. Others looked fascinated. Nobody expected someone to challenge one of the city's most influential figures so openly. The moderator looked ready to change the subject immediately. Ethan remained perfectly still. Grace was not finished. "The strongest leaders I have ever met are the ones willing to admit they do not know everything." Her voice stayed calm, respectful, honest. Because the moment someone believes they are always the smartest person in the room, they stop learning. Silence filled the auditorium. The moderator nervously thanked her and moved to the next speaker. Yet the tension remained. Throughout the rest of the event, people whispered behind programs and exchanged curious glances. Everyone waited to see how Ethan would react. Later that evening, guests gathered in the reception hall overlooking the city. Grace stood near a table of refreshments speaking with several teachers when she sensed someone approaching. She turned. Ethan stopped beside her. The surrounding conversations seemed to fade. "You embarrassed me in front of 300 people," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Did I? You knew exactly what you were doing." "I was answering a question." Ethan stared at her. For a second, she expected frustration, maybe even anger. Instead, something unexpected appeared in his expression. Reflection. "And?" she asked. "And what? Were you listening?" For the first time all evening, Ethan had no immediate response. Grace held his gaze. Around them, Manhattan glittered beyond the glass walls. Finally, Ethan looked away toward the skyline. Because deep down, he knew something that nobody else in that room understood. The reason her words bothered him so much was because part of him feared she might be right. The weeks that followed should have been some of the busiest of Ethan's career. Instead, they became the most distracting. Problems began appearing inside Blackwood Capital with unusual frequency. A major development project stalled after unexpected permit delays. A senior executive resigned without warning. Two board members openly disagreed during a quarterly strategy meeting. None of these issues were catastrophic on their own, but together they created something Ethan hated: uncertainty. Normally, he would have solved every problem immediately. That was what he was known for: precision, control, results. Yet lately his concentration seemed divided. During one board meeting, an executive spent 10 minutes explaining a proposed acquisition before realizing Ethan had not heard half of it. That had never happened before. "Are you all right?" one board member asked after the meeting. Ethan gave the same answer he always gave: "Of course." But he was not entirely sure that was true. Meanwhile, Grace remained focused on her students. She knew nothing about the growing tensions inside Ethan's company. Her days were filled with lesson plans, parent conferences, and helping children prepare for a citywide academic competition. One rainy afternoon, she stayed late organizing materials for the following week. As she carried a box of books into the library, she noticed a maintenance crew working in the hallway. Fresh equipment had arrived. New computers were being installed. Classroom technology was being upgraded. The changes had appeared quietly over the past month. No publicity, no announcements, no cameras, just improvements. The funding came through faster than expected, the principal told her. Whoever approved it removed most of the restrictions. Grace stopped walking. Removed them? Almost all of them. The principal smiled. Teachers are keeping control of the curriculum. Grace felt genuinely surprised. She knew exactly who had the authority to make that decision. Later that evening, Ethan stood alone in his office overlooking the city. Rain streaked across the glass. Manhattan glowed beneath a blanket of clouds and reflected light. An assistant entered carrying several reports. "The revised education agreement has been finalized." Ethan nodded. "Good. The board is asking why so many conditions were removed." Ethan continued looking out the window. "Because they were unnecessary." The assistant looked confused. Months earlier, Ethan would never have said that. He knew it. The assistant knew it. Everyone who worked for him knew it. After the assistant left, Ethan sat at his desk and stared at a framed photograph from years ago. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside his father outside a small business that no longer existed. For a long time, he simply looked at it. Then he realized something uncomfortable. Grace had not changed his company. She had changed the questions he was asking himself. And those questions were becoming impossible to ignore. Across Brooklyn, Grace locked her classroom and stepped into the evening rain. Her phone buzzed with a new message. She opened it and froze. The sender was Ethan. The message was short, almost surprisingly simple. "Thank you for being honest when everyone else was afraid to be." Grace stared at the screen for several seconds. Then a small smile appeared. Because for the first time since they met, she was beginning to realize that the man behind the reputation might be changing in ways even he did not fully understand. By early December, the city had settled into that strange season when daylight disappeared too early and everyone seemed to move a little faster through the cold. The annual academic competition was only 2 weeks away, and Grace's students had been preparing for months. For many of them, it was their first opportunity to represent the school outside their neighborhood. They were excited, nervous, determined. Then everything began to fall apart. 3 days before the registration deadline, the school received notice that the competition venue had changed. Transportation costs doubled overnight. Several sponsors withdrew support due to budget reductions across the district. The school suddenly faced a shortfall large enough to force cancellation. Grace sat in the principal's office staring at the numbers. The disappointment hurt more than she expected, not because of the event itself, but because she knew what it meant for the children. She had already seen the excitement in their faces, already listened to them talk about the trip, already watched them believe in themselves a little more than before. "There has to be another way," she said quietly. The principal rubbed her forehead. "I have called everyone." Grace looked down at the paperwork spread across the desk. For the first time in weeks, she felt completely stuck. Later that evening, she found herself walking through the cold streets of Brooklyn with no destination in mind. Snowflakes drifted through the air beneath yellow streetlights. Her phone remained in her coat pocket. She knew exactly who could solve the problem with a single phone call. But she also knew she did not want to ask. Pride had nothing to do with it. She simply wanted the students to succeed because people believed in them, not because a billionaire rescued the situation. Across Manhattan, Ethan was dealing with problems of his own. Another board meeting had ended badly. Several investors questioned recent decisions. A planned acquisition remained uncertain. Yet none of those concerns stayed in his mind when he noticed a message from Grace that had arrived hours earlier. It contained only 4 words. "Can I ask something?" Ethan responded immediately. 10 minutes later, they were sitting across from each other inside a quiet coffee shop halfway between Brooklyn and Manhattan. The windows fogged from the warmth inside. Holiday music played softly overhead. Grace explained the situation, the competition, the missing funds, the disappointed students. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stirred his coffee slowly. "You know I can solve this in 5 minutes." Grace smiled faintly. "That is exactly why I almost did not call." Ethan nodded. He understood. More importantly, for the first time, he respected the reason. "What do you need?" he asked. Grace looked surprised. "You are asking me? You know the situation better than I do." The answer seemed simple, but both of them recognized how unusual it was. Months ago, Ethan would have arrived with a solution already prepared. Now he was listening first. Grace outlined several ideas. Community partnerships, volunteer transportation, local fundraising. Ethan asked questions, took notes, offered suggestions, not as the man in charge, as a partner. 2 hours later, they walked out into the cold night air with a workable plan. Grace looked up at him beneath the glow of the streetlights. "Thank you." Ethan shook his head. "You were the one who figured it out." As they walked in opposite directions, Ethan realized something he had never expected. Out of everyone in his world, filled with executives, advisors, and experts, the person whose judgment he trusted most was a teacher from Brooklyn. The academic competition turned out to be a bigger success than anyone expected. Students who had once doubted themselves stood confidently in front of judges and audiences. Parents filled the auditorium with nervous smiles. Teachers exchanged hopeful glances. Grace spent most of the day moving from group to group, encouraging anxious students and celebrating every small victory. By evening, the school had earned multiple awards, but the trophies were not what mattered most. The children walked a little taller. They believed in themselves. That was the real victory. Ethan arrived near the end of the event, not as a sponsor, not as a guest of honor, simply as someone who wanted to see the outcome. He stood quietly near the back of the auditorium, watching students rush toward Grace with excited stories and proud smiles. He noticed something that had become impossible to ignore. Whenever she entered a room, people seemed better afterward, more confident, more hopeful, more themselves. It was a kind of influence money could never purchase. Later that night, after the celebration ended, Grace found herself sitting on the steps outside the venue. Snow drifted gently through the cold air. The city lights reflected off the sidewalks in soft patterns of gold and silver. She was exhausted, the good kind of exhausted. Ethan appeared a few moments later carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from a nearby cafe. He handed one to her without a word. Grace smiled. "You remembered. You said coffee after 8 o'clock keeps you awake all night. You actually listened." Ethan sat beside her. "Apparently I do that now." Grace laughed softly. The sound mixed with distant traffic and the quiet rhythm of the city settling into night. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable, familiar. Eventually, Grace looked out at the skyline. "You know, 6 months ago, I would have assumed you hated evenings like this." Ethan followed her gaze. "Why?" "No meetings, no negotiations, no strategies, no billion-dollar decisions." Ethan considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, I probably would have. The answer surprised them both. A cold breeze drifted through the street. Grace pulled her coat tighter. "What changed?" Ethan looked down at the cup in his hands. The steam curled upward into the winter air. He thought about boardrooms, private jets, luxury apartments, endless schedules. Then he thought about classrooms filled with construction paper, laughter, and people who cared more about purpose than prestige. Finally, he looked at Grace. "I started paying attention to different things." Her eyes met his. Neither looked away. For a brief moment, the city seemed quieter, smaller, less important. Then Grace smiled and glanced toward the students still celebrating inside the building. The spell broke gently, yet something remained, something neither of them could name. As the night grew later, they continued talking about simple things. Childhood memories, favorite books, terrible school lunches, dreams they had never shared with anyone else. Hours passed unnoticed, and somewhere between the falling snow and the glow of city lights, Ethan realized a truth he could no longer deny. He no longer looked forward to winning arguments with Grace Parker. He looked forward to seeing her, hearing her laugh, watching her explain the world. For a man who had spent years chasing achievements, it was both the most unexpected and the most important realization of his life. January arrived with sharp winds and gray skies. The holidays were over. The city returned to its relentless pace. For a while, everything seemed steady. Grace focused on her students. Ethan focused on work. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted between them. They spoke more often. Text messages became conversations. Conversations became part of their daily routine. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Grace had stayed late organizing materials for a new literacy program when the principal called her into the office. "You should see this," she said. Several documents were spread across her desk. Grant approvals, financial records, correspondence from various educational foundations. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then Grace noticed a familiar name. Blackwood Capital. Her eyes narrowed. She continued reading. More documents appeared. More signatures. More approvals. Her stomach tightened. Months before she had met Ethan, several opportunities had quietly appeared at the school. Additional classroom resources. Expanded teacher training. Funding requests that had somehow been accelerated through administrative channels. According to the paperwork, Ethan's organization had been involved much earlier than anyone realized. "I do not understand," Grace whispered. The principal looked confused. "Understand what?" Grace did not answer. Her mind was already racing. That evening she requested additional records. By the next day, she had assembled a timeline. The pattern disturbed her. Ethan's foundation had been tracking educational initiatives connected to her school long before their first public disagreement. Long before the fundraiser. Long before she believed their story began. Rational explanations existed. The school had been under consideration for support. Large foundations reviewed hundreds of institutions every year. Yet emotion rarely listened to reason. The more Grace stared at the documents, the more one question echoed in her mind. Had their connection been genuine? Or had Ethan been influencing events from the beginning? 2 nights later, she sat alone in her apartment when another email arrived. This one contained information she had not requested. Internal correspondence accidentally forwarded by a district administrator. One sentence immediately caught her attention. "Continue monitoring the Parker proposal." Grace froze. Parker. Her last name. Her heartbeat accelerated. The message was nearly a year old. Long before Ethan had ever introduced himself. Long before their conversations. Long before the trust that had slowly formed between them. For the first time since meeting him, doubt entered the space where certainty had lived. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the school carrying news he believed would make Grace happy. Additional funding had been approved for several student programs. He found her standing alone in an empty classroom. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating rows of small desks. Something felt wrong immediately. "Grace." She turned slowly. Her expression stopped him cold. No smile. No warmth. No welcome. Only disappointment. "How long?" she asked quietly. Ethan frowned. "How long what?" Grace held up a folder. "How long have you been involved in my life without telling me?" The room fell silent. Ethan looked at the documents, then back at her. In that instant, he understood exactly what she had found. And for the first time since they met, he realized that the truth she believed and the truth he intended were about to collide in a way neither of them was prepared for. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The classroom felt unusually quiet. Outside the windows, students crossed the playground beneath a pale winter sky. Inside, everything they had built seemed suspended by a single misunderstanding. Grace held the folder tightly. "You knew about me before we met." Ethan looked at the papers again. "Not the way you think." "Then explain it." His instinct was to defend himself, to present evidence, to dismantle every incorrect conclusion one by one. That was what he always did. Facts, logic, control. Yet something stopped him. Maybe it was the disappointment in her eyes. Maybe it was the realization that winning this argument would mean losing something far more important. "The school was being evaluated long before I knew your name," he said quietly. "My foundation reviews hundreds of programs every year." Grace crossed her arms. "And the email mentioning me?" Ethan exhaled slowly. You submitted a proposal for literacy funding almost a year ago. Her expression changed slightly. I remember. Your proposal stood out. Grace stared at him. Why? Ethan could have talked about statistics, educational outcomes, community impact. Instead, he chose honesty, because it sounded like someone who genuinely cared. The words hung between them. Simple, unpolished, real. Grace looked away first. Part of her wanted to believe him. Another part felt hurt that she had not known the entire story. You should have told me. Ethan nodded. I should have. Silence returned. This time heavier, more painful. Were any of our conversations real? She asked softly. The question hit harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Ethan took a step forward. Every single one. Grace looked up. Then why does it feel like I only know half the truth? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again. For most of his life, vulnerability had felt like weakness. He shared results, not fears. Achievements, not regrets. Yet standing there, none of those habits seemed useful anymore. Because I spent years becoming someone who controls information, he admitted. I decide what people see, what they know, what they hear. His voice grew quieter. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that trust works differently. Grace listened carefully. Trust requires honesty. I know, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Ethan nodded. I know that too. Another long silence followed. Then Grace placed the folder on a desk. I need time. The words hurt because they were reasonable. Ethan accepted them anyway. Okay. No argument. No persuasion. No pressure. Just one word. Grace seemed surprised by that. So was he. She picked up her coat and walked toward the door. Halfway there, she stopped. Without turning around, she asked, What changed? Ethan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Months ago you would have fought harder than this. He looked around the classroom. Student artwork covered the walls. Crayon drawings. Handwritten goals. Small reminders that progress rarely happened overnight. Finally he answered. Because this is not a business problem. Grace slowly turned back toward him. Ethan held her gaze. And because for the first time in my life, I care more about being honest than being right. She said nothing. Yet something in her expression softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something closer to understanding. After she left, Ethan remained alone in the classroom. The winter sunlight faded across empty desks. For years he had built his life around rules that protected him from uncertainty. Now he stood in the middle of the most uncertain moment he had ever faced. And despite everything, he knew one thing with complete certainty. He was finally willing to break his own rules if it meant earning back her trust. 3 weeks passed before Grace called. Ethan did not pressure her. He did not send gifts. He did not arrange chance encounters. He did not use influence to shorten the distance she had asked for. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he allowed something important to unfold without trying to control it. During those weeks, winter slowly loosened its grip on the city. Snowbanks disappeared from sidewalks. The air softened. Students returned to playgrounds. Life moved forward. One Saturday morning, Ethan received a message. Would you like to help judge the student literacy showcase today? He stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Yes. The event took place in the school gymnasium where so much of their story had begun. Families filled the folding chairs. Children's artwork covered the walls. Excited voices echoed beneath the high ceiling. When Ethan arrived, Grace was already there helping students prepare presentations. Their eyes met across the room. No dramatic moment followed. No perfect speech. Just a quiet smile from her and a quiet smile from him. Somehow it felt more meaningful than either of them expected. Throughout the afternoon, they worked side by side. They listened to students' read stories. They handed out certificates. They celebrated accomplishments. Everything felt natural again, but different too. Stronger. More honest. After the event ended and the families left, they remained behind helping clean up decorations. The gym slowly emptied until only the two of them remained. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long golden shadows across the floor. Grace folded the last banner and set it aside. You really did it, she said softly. Ethan looked up. Did what? You changed. He laughed quietly. I think I am still figuring that out. Grace nodded. So am I. For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan took a breath. There is something I need to say. Grace waited. Ethan glanced around the empty gym. The place looked ordinary. Scuffed floors. Folding chairs. Construction paper decorations. yet it felt more important than any boardroom he had ever entered. For most of my life, I believed success meant being right, he said. Having answers. Staying in control. His voice remained calm but sincere. Then I met someone who challenged every assumption I had. Grace felt her heart tighten. Ethan smiled slightly. You never cared about my reputation. You never cared about my money. You cared about whether I was listening. The afternoon sunlight reflected in his eyes. And somewhere along the way, you taught me something I should have learned years ago. Grace stepped closer. Ethan looked directly at her. Everyone followed my rules. His smile deepened. You taught me how to live. For a second, the entire world seemed quiet. Then Grace laughed through tears she had not expected. Not because the moment was perfect, but because it was real. She reached for his hand. Ethan squeezed it gently. Outside, children played on the school grounds beneath the first warm afternoon of spring. Inside, two people stood together in the place where everything had started. Ethan Blackwood had built companies, earned fortunes, and accomplished goals most people only dreamed about. Yet the most valuable thing he ever gained was not a business, a title, or a number on a balance sheet. It was the courage to become a better man because one ordinary teacher refused to be impressed by anything less. And sometimes the people who change our lives are not the ones who enter with power. They are the ones who enter with truth.